We know about the growing number and interest in public banks, in land trusts, in public utilities, in social enterprise. There's something brewing at the theory level. There's something really brewing below the surface at the grassroots level. And there's a coming together of the notion that something is fundamentally wrong and that for us to get there is going to require systemic change. Something beyond corporate capitalism and certainly beyond state socialism. And I think that's an emerging consensus behind the need for this conference. We've had 10,000 people who signed the statement saying that's what we need to do, and that number growing every day if you go to that website, saying it's time to open this question in a serious way. Bill McKibben, of course, Julie, David Orr, Herman Daly, Lester Brown, Bob Costanza, Richard Feinberg, Noam Chomsky, Robert Reich. 2 big conferences have been held, one at Harvard, one at MIT. Changing the system is being legitimated as a real question. How do we do it? What does it look like? If you don't like corporate capitalism, you don't like state socialism, what do you want?
In the 1930s, during the dark days of the Depression, as it was gearing up, and before the New Deal had really come into place, there was extraordinary experimentation taking place in communities and states all over this country. People realized that no one was coming to save them, and so they began to experiment to build their communities in the face of this extraordinary economic collapse. Those experiments were then scaled up into things we know now that are part of the DNA of this country, like Social Security, but it began in communities. Historians call this the laboratories of democracy. And my view is that we are in a similar situation today, and that there is extraordinary experimentation on building a next economy taking place day in and day out all over this country. This comes in the face of extraordinary pain in our communities. The fact that one study showed 90% of our core urban areas have become less stable in the last decade. Traditional economic development is failing our cities and our nation. And in the face of this, there is a torrent of experimentation taking place in our communities. New models of democratizing wealth and rebuilding the local economy. New structures and institutional arrangements that make real the vision of a next economy. Today, 1/3 of Americans belong to some form of cooperative in this country, including credit unions, that serve 107 million people and manage $1.3 trillion in assets. That's roughly the same amount of assets managed by Citibank, one of the big 5. Nearly 10 million Americans work in employee-owned firms and worker cooperatives. About 7,000 companies representing $1.2 trillion in assets. Community development financial institutions, local financial institutions which specialize in lending in low-income communities have grown in assets from $2 billion in 1994 to more than $64 billion today. The trajectory is up and up and up. Publicly owned municipal enterprises, from electricity providers to broadband telecommunications, expanding all over the country. The story we hear is everything's being privatized. In fact, public ownership is expanding at the community level. Cities and states exploring the creation of public banks. Housing and commercial land trusts being expanded. Trusts that allow for public management and ownership of natural resources that in turn provide revenue streams from that capital to provide basic services in communities. City governments are now putting line items in their budgets to develop cooperative worker-owned enterprises. The outline of a new economy founded on broad-based ownership is being born within the structure of the current prevailing corporate capitalist economy that we know, from the ground up. Now at the Democracy Collaborative, we consider this new approach to business, jobs, economy, what we call community wealth building. It's a new framework for building local, inclusive, equitable, resilient, stable, and sustainable communities. It emphasizes the importance of place. It says we can't keep throwing away our cities like we are our infrastructure, like we have in Cleveland and so many other older industrial cities. It emphasizes decentralized power. By power, I don't mean electricity power, I mean political power and governing power. It looks at how do we recirculate our money in our city systems so that all of our resources don't keep leaking out, but we can use it to keep putting people back to work. It's about leveraging existing assets. We don't all need to go running all over the place trying to become the next biotech center, the next Silicon Valley. We can leverage the legacy assets that we have. And most of all, it's about broadening and democratizing ownership over capital. And so let me give you 4 examples of what I mean. And bear in mind, none of these things existed 5 or 6 years ago. 35 miles from here in Cleveland, Ohio, is a network of worker cooperatives that's been built in some of the most distressed and disadvantaged neighborhoods of our city. I live in Cleveland. The brand name of the network of businesses is Evergreen. We have the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, Evergreen Energy Solutions, a renewable energy company, Green City Growers, all providing goods and services to the local economy, and in particular to the major anchor institutions, the hospitals, the universities. All of these companies are committed to being the greenest in their sector in Northeast Ohio. They currently employ 140 men and women, many who had barriers to employment, formerly incarcerated, low educational attainment, and so forth. They receive living wage salaries, family supporting jobs, it's healthcare benefits, a full package, and profit sharing as part of the company structure. And most importantly, these companies are not just about the companies and the workers themselves, they're explicitly tied to the transformation of the community. And there's a holding company structure to keep all this together, and there are new companies in the pipeline. Our goal is to have at least 1,000 jobs coming through this process. So this is a new institutional structure that has been built in Cleveland, designed to harness the economic power of the city's multi-billion-dollar hospitals and universities and drive that money locally to benefit the residents of Cleveland. It is, in a sense, a planning regime in our city that didn't exist before to resurrect the economy. If you happen to be in New York City anytime from today through the end of February, please go to the Smithsonian Institution's Cooper Hewitt Museum. There's a fabulous exhibit that's just opened called By the People, Designing a Better America. 60 on-the-ground design models. They're producing more inclusive and sustainable communities are featured. Evergreen is one of those 60. In Rochester, New York, which used to be the home of Kodak, still is. At one point, 30 years ago, 35,000 people worked for Kodak. Kodak didn't make the right bet on the digital camera. Today, less than 3,000 people work for Kodak in Rochester. You can imagine the impact on that city. We at the Democracy Collaborative have worked with the mayor there, Mayor Warren, to build what's called the Market-Driven Cooperative Corporation, which is a new entity that's been incubated by the city, designed to create worker-owned cooperative businesses in that city, again linked to the financial power. Richmond, Virginia is home to the nation's first city government Office of Community Wealth Building. There's an explicit unit of government that is designed to build the economy from the perspective of democratizing ownership in that city. And in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where 6 major anchor institutions, including the 2 largest health systems, who are fierce competitors, who never work together on anything, they just announced last week, along with a team of 6 anchor institutions, including the public school system, the city government, the community foundation, the community college, Healthy Neighborhoods Albuquerque, with a commitment to drive their resources locally to create jobs and wealth for the poorest among the citizens. None of these innovations were even on the radar a few years ago. There are literally hundreds around the country. These are not projects. These are new institutional designs to change the local system in each community so that it produces fundamentally different outcomes. The systems of our cities and our nation are producing outcomes of greater environmental degradation, greater wealth and income inequality, greater instability in our core urban areas. Can we be bold enough to think that we can redesign our local systems to naturally produce the kind of outcomes that we want? A new economy, in my view, is being built from the ground up. Now, that's not enough, but something is happening in our communities. And the question for us, I think, is are we willing to think boldly? Are we willing to not be the alternative, the nice, good, progressive alternative to business as usual? Can we imagine becoming the paradigm, the norm, the way business is practiced in this country? So today, democratic ownership is being built in communities. Perhaps tomorrow, democratic ownership will be built in our nation and among our largest corporations.
Prior to the New Deal, the things that were happening that became national events and became national legislation looked like this. The problem becomes whether we recognize that we actually have the potential to create the next system rather than projects. Did you notice that we nationalized General Motors and Chrysler and AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, and de facto the big banks when the last crisis occurred? It isn't only at small levels that things can change over time. And that too is a historical process that we're engaged in. So seeing ourselves in history as building towards, personally, laying the groundwork in knowledge, experimentation, and real-world theory and practice, laying that groundwork out of which comes the next system, is the view we take, and I think that's historically positive and likely, and indeed well worth it because it's all positive change in anything. This takes time, and the climate change problem doesn't give us time. So there are some other interesting processes and some opportunities that are emerging. So let me congratulate you first, that is the environmental movement as a whole. And I include myself as part of that. I ran Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day's legislative shop for quite a while. There's something going on that is really interesting with regard to the larger themes. There is a loss of belief in the value of reserves of the major oil companies. But there are questions being asked by the SEC right now about Exxon as to whether or not they are taking into account the fact that the climate change movement is growing and challenging the value of their reserves. That's a big deal. They know that the threat that's growing raises big, big questions about what they are doing. And there is a loss of confidence. What are those reserves going to be worth over time as the movements grow worldwide? The other thing that's gone on, and this is probably new turf for some people, is something called quantitative easing in the United States. For those who are not economists, and amongst the economists, for those who are not financial economists, know about the banking system, every central bank creates money out of nowhere. There is no little pot of gold. The creation of money must expand as the economy expands. Quantitative easing is a term they used, partly, I think, to confuse people because it's such an odd term. In the last financial crisis, they created over $3 trillion in buying up assets. How? The language of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, of course, we just pushed a button on the computer and created $3 trillion. That's how it's done. That's conventional in banking circles. That's the way the banking system works. Given the problems for the reserves that are being built up and being challenged, one way out of the problem we now face is to buy them out. Buy out the oil companies, partly to get them out of the way so we can get on with the business of building a sustainable economy. The question of using that financial technique, and this is new turf, opening up that question like we opened up Social Security, like we opened up the financial questions in the 30s, like we opened up labor law, to use the power the banks have now are using for other purposes and say, get these guys out of the way so we can get on with the business of building a sustainable economy and deal with the global crisis that climate change presents. That's new turf, and that's spooky turf for some people. But it is something that is emerging out of the two big trends we're beginning to see. One, the challenge that is beginning to emerge. There is no solution so long as we have the political power of the major oil companies blocking all the things that need doing. And on the other hand, quantitative easing discussion that's happening all over the world, by the way, in Britain, here as well. There's a whole new financial economist discussion of how to do this. This is not something we're just inventing. There's a structure of ideas in the financial community, in the banking community, and in the academic community about specifically how to take on this work. Bernie Sanders, chief banking advisor, is one of the leaders of this movement on quantitative easing and the new monetary theory. So there's a good deal of research done on it. The banks do it all the time. And the question is to bring together these two things and say, it's time to say, get out of the way. There is world crisis facing us. Stop blocking what needs to be done. And this is one way that it might happen. Footnote, they may very well be happy to accept the deal. because the value of the reserves are going to go down and down as the movement builds up. We don't have to think only about, wouldn't it be nice if the oil companies got out of the way and stopped blocking what needs to be done in climate change. We can begin to present a challenge. And even presenting the challenge in a sophisticated way, I think, opens up new space for all of us on these larger order questions. Financing what needs to be financed in terms of alternatives of the kind Ted's talking about, green alternatives, can also be done in this way. You can finance a green bank this way. That's one of the most obvious ways to do it. Most people think there is a limited amount of money. There's a strong conservative interest in saying, oh, there isn't enough budgetary capacity to do this. In the modern economy, so long as we have unemployed resources and unemployed people and unemployed factories, the problem is not a fixed limit to what we can do, so long as there's excess capacity. The problem now is an outdated monetary system controlled by the Federal Reserve Board, which is largely dominated by the big banks. So that's where the big fight can be opened up, we think, and we wanted to open that issue to the environmental discussion and to the climate change discussion in particular, that we could pose a different threat, and the threat itself of opening up this debate may well split and divide some of the people involved, some of the companies involved who are worried about their asset base. It is spooky for them, and who might actually see this as a positive deal. In any case, we're suggesting that it's time to have this kind of debate as well as a bold attack on the question of what is to be done now. We don't have immediate action other than the movement building, which has to be done. Now we can open up, I think, a second front on the war on climate change.
From the grassroots level and the neighborhood-based level to the level of the Federal Reserve, tremendous economic opportunities that are definitely shifting. I don't know how many of you, as Ted was talking, were thinking about other projects that sort of align themselves with the four that Ted was mentioning. I found myself thinking about Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they have publicly owned broadband delivering the 100 megabits per second to every household.
Thank you, David. I was here last year when you were building this place, and it's great to see it all done. So I'd be, I think, remiss to say that it is a little silly to be framing the challenges with my favorite old white men, and then a couple of women responding to that. That should be said. There's a burgeoning grassroots explosion of innovation happening that prioritizes ownership and community control over financialization and capital. And it's just a choice right now. Are we going to shift toward that and be bold enough? Or how money is created with interest, but you didn't necessarily say that it should be created without interest, and you named corporate power and monopoly laws, but didn't necessarily say what should be changed. You named consumerism, but not necessarily the mindset out of which the system arises and that makes us consumers, and how that could be shifted and in fact is critical. And you named quantitative easing, but you didn't name redistribution of wealth. That wealth is created into very few hands, and it actually has to move out of those hands. My daughter, it was embarrassing to me recently, she's 12, and she said to me, "Now, Mommy, you can grow food in the soil because of the sunshine and the water, and you can build a house if you cut down a tree, right? But you can't actually, you have to have money because you have to have money to buy the land, to have the water, to have the tree." And I was really embarrassed that the world presumably was given to us equally, the seeds and the sunshine and the soil and the trees. But some people got there first or got there later. Some people got there and put a fence around it, now others don't have access to it. Now, I would say we need a kind of massive redistribution of the wealth, of where it's gone, and I'd say there's lots of people who have that wealth who would agree. I loved your quote in the paper that we have to break free of the stifling restrictions of orthodox thinking, of what we think we know about how the world works, that there's no way to deal with the challenge posed by climate change without dealing with the problem of the giant corporation. And I would bang that drum over and over. There's no way without dealing with the problem of the giant corporation. At this point, all the data shows that jobs are created by local, independently owned businesses. All net job growth in the last several decades has been created by businesses under 20 employees, tiny little businesses, micro businesses. That's all the net new job creation in the United States of the last 30 years. From Federal Reserve Bank to Economic Development Quarterly to Harvard Business Review, they all say that the giant corporation is a terrific vehicle for funneling wealth into very few hands. That is a fact. However, if we want the most wealth, the most jobs for the most people, it's directly correlated to the density and diversity of local ownership per place. Those who are in control of their place, who care for their place, who have a relationship with their place, take better care of that place. They ensure that the soil can sequester carbon because they're taking care of the longevity of that place. That's the only path to feeding the world, is a network of small farms globally controlled by the populations who live there. What it looks like on the ground at Bali, we work across North America with 500,000 community entrepreneurs who are in networks in different communities, all of them innovating, experimenting, caring for their own places and each other. Now today, the system that we have is maintaining a system of inequality and out of control killing of life. For instance, in New Orleans, a group that we work with called the Good Work Network recently was promised jobs for the people that they work with in the form of a big new hotel and airport that was going to be hiring plumbers and for all their building. This is a city where 54% of the African American men are unemployed. 54%. And yet, Black-owned businesses employ the most Black people in this country. And so they work to help more Black businesses get these contracts. And they had all these promises, and then the night before the big announcement, somebody within the cities had awarded the full contract with no subcontracting to an out-of-state classmate from Yale or some other big school. It happens over and over. We're maintaining a system of inequality to the big rather than to the small, but there's a ton of innovation happening at the grassroots level. Our community foundations are investing right now at the local level. Most of their money is invested in Wall Street. Tiny little bit they give away each year, but most of it they're investing in fracking and payday lending and for-profit prisons. And then they give a tiny bit away to try to solve some of those issues in their community. So we're investing and maintaining a system that is not working. We have to have the boldness to say economic development dollars, like the ones we use in New Orleans, $70 billion of local taxes that we are spending locally, mainly 75% plus goes to subsidize large corporations rather than to what actually works for our communities. We just have the boldness to say in philanthropy that we should not be supporting a system of inequality and that's killing life, that we need to move our resources toward what supports life.
What she said. There's a young person on the stage. Where are the people at the margins who have been surviving despite this crushing system? No, capitalism is not going away. Corporatism may be, and probably a good thing. Exxon is very likely to go broke. Here's one way we can tell if corporatism truly rules. The only way Exxon's not going to go broke is if oil prices shoot up. Oil prices could shoot up tomorrow if somebody sinks a tanker in the Straits of Hormuz or takes out the oil loading ports at Saudi. So if they engineer a surprise that shoots up the oil price, yeah, they run the world. If they don't, if Exxon goes broke like Peabody goes broke, let's stop demonizing the corporate system. That's not the problem. The problem is what's in our heads. It is this narrative that the neolibs got into all of the economics departments and into all classes we all took and into politics, that what we want is more money, that's what will make us happy, that we're greedy, self-actualizing, rugged individual bastards. Nothing's going to change until we change this narrative. And then nothing will change until we have a strategy. Gar, Ted, you guys are our movement's data hounds. You're brilliant at figures, facts, dense documents. You did put forth little blips of some answers. This stuff ain't new. You said it yourself. We were inventing all this stuff before the Great Depression. We wrote the Economic Renewal Project in 82, 83. Jane Jacobs was talking about cities as the engine of economic prosperity. I think her first book was in the 60s. This stuff ain't new. Next System Project. We don't need a next system. What we need is, as a group, to come together and agree on how it is we're going to go forward. We're a bucket of crabs. Whenever any one of us starts to gain elevation, the rest of us clog down. Why? Because of funding. It's a zero-sum game. If you get the money, I don't. We're all, as advocates of this stuff, trying to put forth, oh, my idea. It's my idea. It's new. We're doing the same darn thing that the corporates do. with Skippy. New and improved.
Hunter, can I ask you a question? You said about changing the narrative. We've had this rugged individualistic narrative about corporate culture that honors the Richard Bransons of the world.
The Donald Trumps of the world.
If you must.
It ain't me that must. It's something like 40% of the American population that may well vote for the son of a bitch.
What narratives do you see in corporate culture that are changing that corporatism narrative that you described?
Paul Pullman, CEO of Unilever, who said, I ain't going to report quarterly. His stock fell. He said, those of you who have sold, I respect you as human beings, but if you think I can best manage your asset on a 90-day rotation, I don't want you as my owners. Stock's now up hugely. They committed to 100% renewable energy by 2020 to source any of their feedstocks from anything grown from sustainable agriculture, and they freely admit we don't know what that means. So they've hired a bunch of people to help them figure out. John Fullerton and I sat at supper with Case Graythoff, the North American CEO, talking about regenerativeness, and he didn't get it until he saw the film of Gabe Brown regeneratively growing soybeans. Soybeans a big feedstock for him. Case said, that's what you were talking about. He turned to his sustainability folk and said, can we do, we've pledged to be 100% sustainable, can we be 25% regenerative? And sustainability people went, wait, we're just trying to get to be sustainable. This is genuine corporate leadership. Yes, it's rare, but let's stop demonizing these guys. Pick the best of the big guys, the best of the little guys. You're absolutely right. Small business is the job creation engine in this country. Questions of ownership, questions of distribution. Here's a good one for you. We're told in 10 years we're all going to be out of work because of robots. White collar. Robot doctors can run algorithms a whole lot better than a resident who's been up for 36 hours. They don't get tired. Okay, now how are we going to do it? It's that old parable of one person doing all the work, the rest of us out of work, turn off the lights. Until we get into conversations about things like guaranteed livelihood, we're looking at some real challenges.
And I looked at your list of people who you work with. It's pretty left. I'm pretty left. How do we reach out to include the mainstream? How do we get those folks into these discussions?
I totally agree. At the local level, there are an enormous number of people who want to help and don't see themselves as ideologues. I'm overseeing Wisconsin, a city of about 80,000. I go back home and talk to small business people there. It's not the same. It is not the discussion you hear ideologically. Those guys don't have power in Washington, and the big guys do. I speak from experience, bad experience, of both the House and the Senate, where I ran both staffs on both sides. They come in heavily with the big lobbies, with the information, with the advertising, with the money for the campaigns. The big guys are there, and that's how the game is played. Everybody knows that, but I've seen it up close, and it's a very rough game. Those kind of corporate leaders are few and far between. We need more of them. The large corporation is the centerpiece of the big politics in Washington, and we know that, and it has powerful interests. They must grow in order to keep up with the stock market gains, et cetera, which means we're having an onward growth economy in a society in an era when there are limitations to growth.
Michelle, I was wondering if you could talk about the ability in local communities to reach across traditional political boundaries.
We work with people from New Orleans and Detroit to Arizona. You know, it depends on the community that you're in and the politics of that place. But it is in the local place where you see, you can't decide, is it jobs or is it trees? Doing a fellowship program, local economy fellowship program, and one is the director of equity for the city of Oakland, Jose Corona, looking at economic development through a racial and economic justice lens. And he said that the people that are at the table that come and are able to lobby and get their point across are the sales forces of the world and the few large corporations that are in the communities, even though, as he said, 90% of the jobs and what's here are the small businesses, but they don't have a voice.
2 or 3 weeks ago in Cleveland, there was a panel conversation around the conservative case for clean energy. And one of the panelists, who was a former advisor to Governor John Kasich, said, when asked, what should environmentalists be doing, said, environmentalists need to learn how to talk to Republicans.
We need to learn to talk to everybody. How do you talk to somebody? You find out what they care about, and then you frame it to what it is that they care about, not what you care about. Demonizing business is, I think, so damaging. There is a very strong movement, a Green Tea Party down in Georgia, where the Tea Party and the Sierra Club are fighting against the efforts to limit people's ability to put solar on their roofs. I go hang out at the NASCAR races. I'm going to race a Tesla. I'm debating racing my Leaf. I do this and I want to be darn sure that the electric car wins. And you can Google this. Tesla raced a Maserati. The Tesla SUV towed a Maserati and then beat the Maserati it was racing against, towing a Maserati. We can show we have better performing technologies, and it's better business, and it creates jobs. But the missing conversation, as Michelle said, is how do we ensure that Elon doesn't just become the next Richard Branson, that we have distributed ownership in this, and then when all the Tesla factories are all run by robots, how do we ensure that that gain in wealth gets equitably distributed?
Getting our message out and collecting all the dots. As a media person, I'd love to help really get a collective message going on this point, because there is so much content of success right now that is so scalable, communicated in the right way. I would love to be part of that effort. We have our own channel going, and we can leverage it with other channels.
There is an enormous amount going on. We run a website, which is a website bringing other people together. It's called community-wealth.org, which attempts to assemble some of this. In each sector, people know. The co-op people know, and the environmental groups locally know, but they don't have a sense of the breadth of what Ted was talking about. And the media could really pick up on this, and it's out there.
Successfully pitching journalists beyond the environmentally specific, friendly media outlets. What kind of successes have you had in getting that story out?
We haven't had great success. It's happening. There is a whole network to step right into. It's really a choice at this point. Do we move our resources toward what works and what is actually building community wealth and what is building health, or not? We know what to do. Let's shift our resources toward what actually is working at the community level. And Pope Francis said we have to change a lot of things, but most of all ourselves. When you say transformation, some people may mean vanilla to vanilla bean, but some people may mean vanilla to chocolate. But what we really need is vanilla to music. We need like radically different imagination. We need prophetic imagination. We need to light up each other's possibilities that we all actually matter. And these models work, but we can't even see them. So please join us, or lead us, to help us together. Let's lift up these stories. But I haven't had more success.
Last point, Angela.
Joe Confino, Huffington Post, What's Working. Joe is offering our Leading for Wellbeing group a platform to start talking about these stories. Check it out, write for it. That platform is there. Any one of you can become a blogger on Huffington Post. And then let's start using non-traditional media. Here's your dot. Do one thing. Every one of you today, communicate in whichever channel you use. Handwrite a letter, tweet it, do a video for your favorite local access media. What have you seen in your community that's working? Do one thing. Communicate to as many people as you can what's working. Communicate the solutions. This is what Bob Costanza and Ida Kubashevsky do with the Solutions Journal. If any of you haven't read it, go read it. It's all about solutions. Let's stop talking about problems and get on to what works.
What can't be burned is our next topic. Mark Campanelli from the Carbon Tracker Initiative will be presenting. He'll be introduced, however, by Richard Heinberg of the Post-Carbon Institute.
All of you who were at Bill McKibben's brilliant talk last night heard him say how much he was impressed and influenced by the work of carbon trackers. So we're incredibly fortunate to have with us this morning Mark Campanelli, who is the founder of Carbon Tracker. He conceived the thesis of unburnable carbon capital markets, and prior to forming Carbon Tracker, Mark had 25 years experience in sustainable investment funds in Jupiter Asset Management, AMP Capital, and Henderson Global Investors, among others. He's also treasurer of Rainforest Foundation UK and chairman of Emerald Bioenergy.
Yesterday I was watching and listening to the presentations, and having listened to the discussion, I decided to rip up my original presentation and try and do something completely different. Go back to some of the basic questions about carbon budgets and how much time we've got before we run out of runway on 2 degrees and 3 degrees. There's a kind of a battle that's going to play out internationally amongst governments and companies and policymakers. And that battle is tied down to what I would call the fundamentalists, who say what we really need to do to get to 2 degrees. And we know the arguments of keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and we know the logic of that. I don't want to call them the realists or the pragmatists. There's those that are taking a different view. They're saying, well, we're never really going to get there, so let's develop some scenarios that might allow us to get there. And even if they don't, they're the ones that are probably the most realistic. Today, Lord Stern published a paper that says to get to 2 degrees, we need to deploy $90 trillion over the next 15 years in new infrastructure. And of course, on the other side, people saying, well, you know, is that realistic? Right now, there's 1,500 new coal-fired power stations built in the world. Asia's going through a phenomenal period of connecting to electricity, power for the development of their economies. It's just that they're using an energy type which we know has problems with it. The scenarios that governments and policymakers are defaulting to give us a 50% chance of hitting 2 degrees. Not 80%, 50%, which is a bit like if you're getting in a car, you're going to crash it every other time you go out to drive. There's some hope due to the learning curves on technological innovation with downward cost pressures on everything from solar to electric cars, which the energy sector is fundamentally misreading. So Carbon Tracker, when I set it up, we had no idea really that our research would be picked up and taken global by Bill. We published exactly 100 copies of that report on the right. Unburnable carbon are the world's financial markets carrying a carbon bubble. One of our friends and allies at Rockefeller Brothers Fund gave a copy of this report to Naomi Klein, who then gave a copy to Bill. It was one of those 100 printed copies. I think it may have a first edition value to it, given its scarcity. We then went on to produce this article, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, where he set out the numbers. Nick and I, we thought we were doing a 3-month summer job. We could go back to our real lives once we published it. I was working in the City of London for maybe 20 years, the last company I was at. There was a parade of coal companies coming into our company and oil companies, and they're walking out with big checks, 50 million, 100 million. When I picked up the prospectus, this legal document that goes around, the world's biggest coal company at that time listing on the London Stock Exchange, it was a 300-page document. In the risk section, there was precisely 20 lines about climate change as a core risk to the business. Another 300 pages was all about how this was going to be fantastic growth period. That just didn't make sense to me. It was insane. We decided to sit down and just look at these large corporations, add up how much CO2 sits in their reserves and their resources, and that gave us the carbon budget number. The Financial Times picked up the research. I got invited in to meet the Bank of England, and then ultimately went on to present to the Financial Stability Board, which is a construct of the G20, about climate risk. And now Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Carney have this inquiry, which will report in a couple of months' time, about how financial markets can really get their arms around climate risk, and we have big expectations of that. So it's gone from being a kind of a marginal issue, an idea of, well, if the world cannot burn all the fossil fuels, does this have financial consequences? Does this mean a fundamental change to the valuation of these large fossil fuel companies? And almost certainly, without doubt, it does. Now, if you're a a $500 billion company, and someone's going to try and come away and take your business away from you, and you think your stockholders are going to be concerned about it, you really dig in and you fight. So what is the carbon bubble? This shows you the embedded CO2 that sits in the world's reserves and resources, and these are the ones which we understand are most likely to be extracted, and they're divided into 3 columns: coal, oil and gas, and you've got different colours there. The green is the likely net emissions, future emissions associated with this 450 scenario, which is otherwise known as the 2 degrees scenario, is the one that we hope to use about how people think of the world. They live in this world of scenarios. One is business as usual, which are quite terrifying. That heads us to 6 degrees, 7 degrees. Then you've got what's called the new policy scenario, which is the ones that are out there now, which analysts can say, well, that gives us a chance of getting back down to 2. And then you've got what's they call the 450 scenario, which is the scenario most associated with 2 degrees. So blue gives a little bit more ambition as to what can be released, and the shaded yellow is absolutely what we've got to keep in the ground. But there is a problem with this graph, and it's actually in the title. It's the 50%. That's the problem. Because if we go to 80%, we have no runway on future emissions. Not really, because even those green lines are going to come down significantly. So this is actually what the policymakers and governments are playing with. We have about 15 years, 16 years at current rates of emission. These are again different scenarios of what's likely to be released in coming years, given what we know about the pace of emissions. We have about 15 years before we go past the 2 degrees budget. Doesn't mean we get to 2 degrees, because there's a lag effect. It could be 30 years, it could be 40, it could be 100, or it could be 10. And 3 degrees doesn't come that much long after. It comes in around 2045. So we've got to really bend those curves right down. It's another way of saying that we're coming to a point where we have to get to rapid decarbonisation, which is why Lord Stern has put that figure at 70, 80 trillion dollars over 15 years. So we've got a big job to do. This is a temperature gauge. 2 degrees is your carbon budget, how much you can release of around 900 gigatons. Others put it at around 565 gigatons. The unburnable carbon really is the red bit, and that's the number I want to come next to, which is the 741 gigatons. Those of you that have not read the new report from Oil Change International that's come out, if you've not read it, please go away and read it, because they're actually looking at projects, coal, oil and gas projects already under development that they believe have to remain in the ground. So carbon tracker, what was different about us? We knew about the carbon budget, we knew about the fossil fuel companies. What this shows you is stock exchanges across the world, and there's 2 key ones there, USA and the UK, as global financial centres for the fossil fuel industry. People say, well, you've got to change the way government thinks, we've got to mobilise citizens, we have to get to the seat of power. And I look at things slightly differently. I think that's probably right about government and citizens, that's true. But the other root or base of power is, of course, the global economy and, of course, the financiers who fund these projects. If in some way we can break away the owners of capital, and that does mean you and me, from the business world to develop a different narrative, then maybe we've got some chance to counter the power block that certainly exists in the business community to try and thwart a safe climate outcome. So that's why we decided to focus on the investment community. So when you start looking at that green circle, it says 225 gigatons. That's the share that we, as in Carbon Tracker, have notionally allocated to Exxon and Peabody and all the others that are publicly traded. Governments own the remaining part of the carbon budget, Venezuela, the Saudis, the Russians, and so on. The blue, that's the proven, at that time of our research, the proven coal, oil and gas reserves owned by these listed companies at 762. And the 1541 is what they're going out to develop next. It's the cash they're using today, the borrowings, the bond issuances, the equity raises to develop next. They know it's there, they're going to find it, it's in the Arctic, it's in the oil sands, it's in ultra-deep water. That is the conundrum that investors face, and that's why, thankfully, so many institutions, the Dutch, the Norwegians, the Swedish, the French, have picked this up and have been announcing their divestments from coal, and now looking at oil and thinking, wow, this is an industry that has an existential crisis. China and the US and India and the EU have ratified it. It sets a very clear path of significant reductions in emissions big expectation. What's the problem? Now, this is what the companies are saying. And it goes back to the scenarios. BP, Exxon, and Shell, all their core scenarios has the world using 25 to 30% more fossil fuels, oil, over the next 20 to 30 years. So on one side, you've got governments and citizens saying we're going to use less. On the other side, you've got the business world saying every scenario tells us we're using more. Investors don't know who to believe. I sit with these investors and they say, well, on one side, we own the stock of these companies and they're saying the demand's going to go up. And on the other side, we've got governments and they say it's not going to be used. And there's a translation challenge here. I was in Chicago last week. I attended an event of RBC Capital Markets, maybe 5 times the size of this room in terms of attendees. These were the advisors, and they were watching an economist talk about the future and what's going to happen in the global economy over the next couple of years. And of course, he didn't mention Paris. How come he didn't mention the Paris Agreement? And his reply was, what Paris Agreement? And we have a translation problem. If we think that Wall Street is in sync with how we think, obviously it's not. It's got different priorities. It's got quarterly earnings and so on and so forth. OPEC is clinging valiantly to its 54% increase in the use of fossil fuels. This shows you the projected rise in emissions and demand, rather, for fossil fuels associated with emissions. And I said new policies is the one that they think is the most realistic in terms of actually bending down this curve. And actually, it's those lines going up. The blue, look at that rise in coal use. And actually, to get to 2 degrees, you're going to have to bend things aggressively down to get to 450 associated with 2 degrees of warming. And I put some narrative in there, and I want you to drop down and look at that 2040. Look at those decline figures of 45% for coal, 30% for oil, and 20% for gas. And I said, I thought there was a contradiction in our numbers, and there is. If you know that we're going to go through 2 degrees in around 15 years' time, and 3 degrees in around 30 or so, are those decline rates ambitious enough? And clearly the answer to that is no, they're not. And why is that? It's the 450 scenario used in World Energy Outlook, and it's a 50% chance of getting to 2 degrees. 50%! And now we have the problem with the scenarios that people use. Now if you put in the realistic scenarios, those decline rates are going to go down an awful lot. Barclays Bank produced some terrific analysis, a guy called Mark Lewis, to go through those new policy scenario, which is kind of almost like business as usual, with this 2 degrees scenario. And what he's trying to demonstrate there, on the left is drops in energy demand, and on the right, associated drops in carbon dioxide emissions. And again, this is one scenario that really lacks an ambition. What all this really comes down to is what the scientists and the policymakers and the advisors are arguing, that in a carbon budget of around 900 gigatons, that's that grey bar there on the left, it's really simply a mixture of oil, gas and coal. And what you've got there is 3 scenarios. One is where you max out the gas, let's put renewables to one side here. The other is where you get more of a mix between oil and gas and coal, and then the high coal, which is where we are probably now, with those 1,500 new coal-fired power stations in Asia still in the growth phase. You've got coal making up an awful lot more of the mix of the carbon budget. So in the game of Peter robs Paul, Peter, as in coal, robs from Paul, which is gas and oil, and takes most of that remaining carbon budget, which is why oil gets hit an awful lot quicker and harder than the other sectors. If you can't get coal down, then there really is no carbon budget left for these other fossil fuels. For the first time, we saw the oil companies really go after the coal companies. And actually, the oil companies are quite happy that Peabody essentially went into bankruptcy because they think that they've got more time left. But have they? Most of the people I hang out with are investors. They've got a lot tied up in the oil stocks. Exxon, Chevron, Shell, these are some of the biggest companies in the world. Just 2 companies alone, Shell and BP, produce 20% of the dividend distributions paid to stockholders in the UK. That's a huge amount. And that's why people want to own those stock. Fossil fuel companies there on the left, so that has to completely change. And there's some numbers there really, which is expressed in trillions of dollars. What's dawning on Wall Street is the capital expenditure programs of these oil companies are fundamentally misleading. $15 trillion of unneeded capex in the fossil fuel industry. They're going around Wall Street borrowing money, saying, look, demand's going up. Give us the money. Exxon has been borrowing like mad to fund its dividends. Shell has been doing the same. And why they're getting away with leveraging up is because the bankers are still tied into this high demand scenario, so they lend. And it's a problem for the banking system. Banks are lending on the basis of a false premise. And we know the SEC is making some interesting investigations. So there's a revenue challenge here. So on the left you've got this kind of business as usual new policy, and on the right you've got 2 degrees. I want you to see the drop. There's only one thing I want you to look at there, which is the dark blue. I'm making the point about oil. That shows you revenues going out to 2040, $90 trillion of revenues from oil, and under 2 degrees, that's a huge drop. It goes down to about $70 trillion of revenues. So, question, is Wall Street factoring in a massive decline in the fossil fuel economy? And the answer to that is it is not. It's still forecasting growth and business as usual. And what we're doing at Carbon Tracker is we're going to open offices in Wall Street, and we're going to go and sit down with these folks, these key energy sell-side analysts and these investors, to try and take them on and challenge their views. This shows you the forecast annualized growth rates in demand growth for coal, oil and gas. So on the left there you've got historical data, you've got the blue lines, business as usual case, the carbon constraint scenario, which is the grey, and what they're contrasting is that historically, which is your blue, you've got fairly high growth in coal, oil and gas, and to get to the IEA scenario you've got to see big drops, annualised drops in the use of these fuels, and on the right there you've got the zero carbon fuels, what kind of growth rates you've got to go for. How do bankers think? Follow the past because they think the past is a great indicator of the future. Markets revert to mean. Some investors are saying, well, this will all blow over. This is cyclical, we've seen this before. And I'm sitting there going, no, it's structural. Because they think it's just a phase. They're going through a phase. It goes back to the point I make about scenarios. Along the bottom there, you've got the IEA, BP, Shell, each making forecasts in the use and growth and demand for fossil fuels. Everybody's saying essentially the same thing in the energy sector, growth in the use of fossil fuels. Because no matter how we talk about things, inside the minds of a lot of these people, they see no other real change in the future. So, I want to leave something with a bit of hope. And what you've got there is the forecast price downs in battery storage technology, and how Tesla's Powerwall has hit those lower costs because of the learning curve in technology a lot earlier than even the best models have predicted. Technological revolution is forcing down the price and cost of these alternative technologies, which means the take-up rate is going to be much higher than people anticipate.
Your work is in some ways congruent with, in a very interesting way, with some work we've been doing at Post Carbon Institute, which is to look at how many fossil fuel reserves are probably unburnable for economic reasons and thermodynamic reasons. Yeah. A few years ago, as the fracking boom was taking off across America, there was the suggestion by the U.S. Energy Information Administration that there were 15 billion barrels worth of oil in California in the Monterey Shale that could be extracted at great profit and transform California's economy. This looked a bit fishy to us from a geological perspective, so we went and did a thorough geological analysis of the Monterey Shale, which basically showed that what the EIA was proposing was, to put it kindly, unfeasible. But they downgraded their forecast for the Monterey Shale by 96%. There are lots of folks who've been saying there's vast amounts of oil reserves in the U.S. in the Green River Shale in Colorado and Wyoming and so on. Trouble is, nobody's ever been able to produce it at an energy profit, much less a financial profit. And we've been extracting fossil fuels using the low-hanging fruit principle, which means we get the best stuff first. And what's left in many cases is crap. What's left ain't worth much.
We use break-even prices to calculate which companies have projects that are not consistent in 2 degrees and which ones will have portfolios of projects that may have a chance over the next 20 years. And we call it a carbon cost curves analysis, and you can download our oil and gas and coal reports on that topic from our website. Goldman Sachs looking at the break-even prices of all these major new projects coming down the line next, the resources, and something like 70 to 80% of future production requires oil to be above $55 a barrel to break even. And this is one of the reasons why, in the last 2 years, the oil sector has postponed $300 billion of investment in projects. And the other thing that a low oil price has done, thank goodness for the moment, is to keep out the Canadian oil sands. They need $95 a barrel break even to get going. Once they've got going, because of the high capex cost, that drops to a marginal cost down at around 30, 35. And the Canadians, once they get that up and going, they can keep that going for as long as you want. But they can keep that going for 100 years if they wanted to. There's just so much there.
Does that mean that the natural gas glut, the domestic natural gas boom, was actually good in the long term for the future post-carbon economy?
Natural gas certainly was one of the keys to destroying the listed US coal stocks in the last 2 years, without doubt. Peabody had demand forecasts for coal going up north all the way up into the point of bankruptcy. The gas capped that out. What's been more useful is the frackers have been able to turn it on pretty quickly, and every time the oil price goes up above 50, and looks like the Middle East want to start exporting oil back to the US, they managed to slap it back down and keep the oil price down, keeping not just the Middle East out, but more importantly, keeping the Canadians out. What it does is gives you a very narrow time frame to get to where you need to be with renewables. And instead of using the cash that's coming out from the sector to do more fossil fuels, which is what they want to do, it should be actually funding the energy transition. We really want to be starting where we are now, because we should have started 20 years ago. But I mean, realistically, it's going to be no more than 15 to 20 years. When you are sitting on the board of directors of a large oil company and you're planning your capex plans, it's what you decide today that gets going in 15 years' time. Persuade the large institutional owners of these oil companies to essentially put them into an orderly runoff and decline, to stop new capex and new projects, to begin the wind down process, to replace this growth mentality that you get on the boards of these companies, and to put in place a rundown.
Is the leverage with the institutional investors or with the individual board members?
So BlackRock, which is, what is it, a $2 trillion asset management business, they produced a paper a couple of weeks ago on climate risk. It went around the world and they've had very nice stuff in there about unburnable carbon and climate risk, and they said, if this is so important, companies must disclose the risks associated with climate change. Now, unfortunately, I don't know if you spotted this on the same day, the results came out as to who voted in support of the Exxon climate disclosure resolution and who voted against calling on Exxon to disclose the climate risks. Oops. BlackRock, which owns about 7% of the stock of Exxon, voted against the resolutions calling for more climate disclosure. And so what you had was this bizarre situation where the Financial Times...
They pulled an Exxon on Exxon.
Yeah, Financial Times runs this headline, BlackRock climate hypocrisy. And everyone here...
Well, what else would you do with that?
Well, so what you would do is if you're part of an endowment or you're running money and you've got, on one side you've got State Street, who owns 4% of the stock in Exxon, voting in support of these resolutions, which they did, and you've got, on the other side, you've got money with BlackRock, who are voting these down, you just switch, you just move all your money from BlackRock to State Street. And what we're trying to do here is build an alliance of people who are going to vote, who are going to vote in favour of better climate disclosure, who are going to vote for wind-down strategies, and that's a battle of wills. CalPERS is doing a terrific job with the French in leading on this work. And through that, I think we've got more chance to get these companies under control through proper governance and begin that wind down. I think that's how we outrun them, if we can build these alliances.
Gar mentioned prospect of the U.S. government or other governments just printing the money to buy up fossil fuel companies.
It's baloney. And the reason why is because when you bid for the stock of a company, unfortunately the share price goes up. You start bidding for a company in the market, everyone goes, yippee! and I'm hanging on for mine, but you've got to pay me 3 times the market price. I'm not letting mine go. If it was achievable, I would do it tomorrow.